He lost his boat in a storm and thought it was all over. But the island with the lighthouse gave him a new life. Subscribe and write in the comments which city you are watching from. The village always smelled of salt, fish, and smoke, a mixture that clung to the narrow alleys and low wooden houses like a second skin. Morning came slowly over the horizon, spilling pale light across the shoreline and turning the damp nets on the pier silver. Jack Harris woke before dawn, as he always did, to the creak of his mother's house settling in the wind. The old boards groaned under his feet as he stepped into his boots and shrugged on his patched coat, moving quietly so as not to wake her. The sea was waiting, and in this part of the coast, no one wasted daylight when there was a chance to bring in a catch. His father had died out there years ago, his small boat never returning after a storm that had come from nowhere. And yet Jack could not leave the water alone. It was the only trade he knew, and the only way to pay off what was owed for gear and salt and food. He walked down to the pier, the boards slick with the night's dew, and inspected his little boat. The hull bore the scars of years of hard use, the paint peeling, the rope that held the oarlocks fraying in places, but she still floated. That was enough. Jack untied the lines, shoved off from the pier, and let the tide carry him outward before he set to rowing. The air was cool and damp, the kind that clung to skin and promised fog later. Above him the sky was a gray wash streaked with lighter clouds, the sun still hidden. His hands moved automatically, muscle memory built from years of doing the same thing, and soon the boat was far enough from shore that the water darkened beneath him. Jack cast his nets and waited, letting the boat rock gently. The sea had its moods, and today it seemed calm enough, quiet, but not menacing. After a while, the net began to tug. He leaned over, pulling hand over hand, heart quickening as the first silver flashes broke the surface. Good fish, and plenty of them. He smiled despite himself. This haul could mean bread and oil for a week, maybe even a little extra to set aside. For a moment he forgot the heaviness in his chest that came with every dawn, forgot the debts and the stares of the men at the tavern who said he'd never be like his father. It was only when he noticed the horizon darkening that the unease returned. A long bank of clouds was crawling across the sky, low and heavy, and the wind had begun to shift, no longer soft but sharp, pushing the little boat sideways. Jack hesitated, looking from the half-full net to the approaching weather. He should head back. He knew that. But the weight of the catch was so close to enough, and turning back now meant rowing in with a boat only half-loaded. He told himself he could work quickly. Just one more pull. He heaved the net in, muscles straining, tossed the fish into the bottom of the boat, and reached for the oars. By then the sea had changed. The smooth swells had become restless, rising and falling more sharply. The wind was at his back now, driving him farther from shore instead of toward it. And as Jack put his strength into the oars, spray stung his face. He tried to keep the bow pointed toward the village, but every gust swung him off course. Clouds blotted out the sun. The world turned gray, then nearly black, as if night had fallen too early. The first real wave struck from the side, slamming the little boat and sending a sheet of water over the gunwale. Jack cursed under his breath and dug harder at the oars, but the sea was alive now, hurling him upward, dropping him down again, twisting the boat as though it were a toy. Another wave hit, and this time the water stayed, sloshing around his boots. He grabbed the bailer and tried to empty it, but a third wave came, bigger than the rest, and it was all he could do to cling to the thwarts. Then the fourth wave came, and it was the one that broke him. It reared up out of the dark water like a wall and crashed full across the boat, flipping it as easily as a child's hand turns a leaf. Jack went under, salt burning his throat and nose, the roar of the storm filling his ears. When he fought his way to the surface, The boat was gone. All that was left was a broken plank bobbing nearby. He seized it with both hands and held on. Time lost meaning after that. The world narrowed to the taste of brine, the cold gnawing at his muscles, and the relentless black of the water. Sometimes the plank rolled and threatened to slip from his grip, but he clenched his fingers until they ached. Rain pelted his face, and each time he coughed, he swallowed more seawater. His arms felt like lead, and still he held on, because letting go meant sinking, and sinking meant never seeing the sky again. It was near dusk when something changed. The water around him surged differently, a rippling pull that seemed to draw him toward something solid. Through salt-stung eyes, he saw it, a jagged outline rising from the sea, black against the storm clouds. Land. His legs kicked weakly, and somehow he drifted closer until his knees struck rock. He dragged himself forward inch by inch, scraping skin on the sharp stones, until at last he lay on the shore, shivering so hard his teeth clattered. When he lifted his head, he saw it. A tall, lonely lighthouse standing above him on a bluff, its glass eye glowing faintly against the darkening sky. The sight was almost otherworldly, a single steadfast light in a sea of chaos. Jack forced himself to crawl a little farther from the tide line before exhaustion claimed him. The last thing he saw before he passed out was the beam of the lighthouse sweeping slowly across the waves, a steady pulse of light that seemed to promise that he had not come this far just to die. When Jack woke, it was to the smell of wood smoke and the sound of waves breaking against stone far below. He was no longer on the cold, wet rocks where he had collapsed. Instead, he was lying on a narrow cot in a small room whose walls were paneled with wood that had gone gray with age. The blanket that covered him was rough but warm, and his clothes, which had been soaked through, were gone. He pushed himself up slowly, every muscle stiff and sore, and looked around. The room held only a table, a single chair, and a window through which pale light spilled, hazy with salt spray. Beyond the glass he could see the sea, calmer now, but still rolling. The horizon a thin dark line under a washed-out sky. A door opened, and an older man stepped in. His face was lined and weathered, his beard white, and his clothes were practical and plain, worn with the look of someone who worked with his hands every day. He carried a tin mug that steamed in the cool air. Without a word, he set it on the table near the bed and nodded to Jack. His eyes were sharp, but there was no suspicion in them, only a quiet assessment, as though he had seen many such men pulled from the sea and knew how they looked when they were halfway between life and death. Jack tried to thank him, but his throat was too raw from salt water. The man simply motioned for him to drink. The broth was hot and thin, but tasted better than anything Jack had eaten in weeks. Warmth spread through his chest as he drank, and when he was finished, he set the mug aside and lay back again, exhausted. The old man Jack would learn later that his name was Tom, left him to rest, closing the door softly behind him. The days that followed blurred together at first. Jack slept often, his body using every moment to recover from the ordeal. When he woke, he found that clean, dry clothes had been left for him. He put them on awkwardly, still stiff, and looked around the room more closely. Everything here was simple but well kept. There were no wasted objects, no decorations, just the bare essentials of living. Yet the place felt cared for, not abandoned. Eventually, he gathered enough strength to stand and make his way out of the room. The lighthouse was larger inside than it had looked from the shore. Its round stone walls rose up around a spiral staircase that seemed to wind forever toward the top, and every few steps there were shelves with tools, oil cans, and spare parts. The air smelled of kerosene and salt, and somewhere above came the faint, steady tick of machinery. Jack found Tom outside near the base of the lighthouse, stacking driftwood. The man glanced at him, nodded once, and went back to his work. Jack, still unsteady, lowered himself onto a rock and sat in silence, watching. It was the first time he had really looked at the island in daylight. It was not large, a jut of stone with patches of grass, a handful of gulls crying overhead. The sea surrounded it entirely, a restless gray sheet stretching in every direction. For a moment, Jack felt a sharp stab of isolation, but then he looked up at the lighthouse itself, its white walls streaked by weather, but still standing, and felt a strange sense of safety. As the days passed, he began to do small tasks around the place. At first, Tom said nothing, neither forbidding nor encouraging him. But he did not stop Jack when he carried buckets of water from the cistern, or when he gathered driftwood for the stove. Each day seemed to take on a rhythm that Jack had never known in the village. Sunrise, work, a simple meal, more work, then the slow approach of evening when the light had to be tended. It was the tending of the light that fascinated Jack most. Tom climbed the tower each evening, and one day Jack followed him, careful on the narrow steps. At the top, he saw the great glass lens, clean and shining, and the mechanism that turned it. Tom checked the oil, polished the glass, and set the mechanism moving until the beam began its slow, sweeping rotation over the darkening sea. Standing there, watching that steady light cut across the waves, Jack felt something stir in him that he could not quite name. It was purpose, perhaps, or simply the recognition that this place mattered, that its presence meant safety for those far away. At night, the island was almost silent, except for the crash of the surf below. Jack sat sometimes outside the lighthouse, staring at the stars. Back in the village, night had always been loud with shouting, with laughter from the tavern, with arguments over money or fish. But here, there was only wind and sea. The quiet pressed in, but instead of frightening him, it began to soothe him. Weeks went by. Jack's body regained its strength, his hands once again rough from work, but no longer raw from salt. He learned how to keep the lamp fueled, how to clean the lens properly so the beam never dimmed, and how to read the logbook in which Tom recorded the weather and the passing of ships. Tom spoke little, but when he did, his voice was calm, steady, a voice that belonged to a man who had spent decades alone, but had made peace with it. Jack found himself changing in ways he did not expect. The urgency that had always driven him, the need to catch more fish, to pay more debt, to do more in less time, began to fade. Here there was no race, no one to compete with. Work was done because it needed doing, and it was done well or not at all. At night, lying in the small room under the slanted roof, Jack felt the exhaustion of honest labor, but he also felt something close to contentment. Eventually, though, the storms passed, and the sea grew calmer, its surface once again shining like a sheet of glass at dawn. The nets that hung drying in the sun reminded Jack of what waited for him back in the village. There were still debts, still mouths to feed, still the daily struggle that would not simply vanish because he had been given refuge here. One morning he rose early, earlier even than Tom, and walked to the shore. The little boat that had brought him here had been righted and repaired during his stay, and now it rocked gently in the water, waiting. He stood there for a long time, listening to the waves, before he turned and went back to the house. Tom was already awake, standing near the door. There was no surprise in the old man's face, only a look that told Jack he had been expecting this moment. Jack nodded once, unable to find words, and began to gather his few things. By midday he was ready to leave. The sky was clear, the wind fair. He pushed off from the island and watched as the lighthouse receded slowly into the distance, its white tower growing smaller against the sky, until at last it was just a pale finger on the horizon. For a long time after, he kept glancing back, even when there was nothing left to see. When he finally turned the boat toward the distant outline of the village, he felt as though he was leaving more than just a place behind. Something had shifted inside him during his time on the island, though he could not yet name what it was. He rowed on in silence, feeling the weight of the oars, but also the weight of a decision he knew was not truly finished. When Jack returned to the village, it felt as though no time had passed at all, yet he knew that he was no longer the same man who had left. The familiar sight of the pier, the worn planks, the salty air, and the voices of the other fishermen should have brought comfort, but instead, they felt strangely distant. The first morning back, he dragged himself out to the water, repaired the nets, and joined the others, rowing hard as if to prove to himself that he could still do it. But every pull of the oar felt heavier than before. The sea no longer seemed like a companion, but a place that demanded something from him, something he wasn't sure he could give again. The village was as loud as ever. Men argued over whose catch was larger, women shouted from doorways, children ran barefoot through the streets. At night, when the tavern filled with smoke and laughter and curses, Jack found himself sitting outside instead of going in, staring at the horizon where he imagined the lighthouse might be, a faint light invisible from this distance, but present in his memory. The sense of order he had known on the island seemed impossible here. Each day he went through the motions casting nets, mending lines, hauling the day's catch to market, but a restless unease had settled inside him. Weeks passed like this. Jack grew quieter, speaking little, his thoughts often elsewhere. Sometimes he would wake in the middle of the night. Sure, he had heard the distant sound of waves against rock, or the creak of the spiral stair inside the lighthouse. He missed the silence most of all, the long stretches of calm when all that could be heard was the hum of the sea and the tick of the clockwork in the lamp. Here, there was never silence. Even when everyone slept, there was the sound of dogs barking, of doors slamming, of wind rattling loose shutters. Then, one evening as he sat outside his mother's house, a boy from the pier ran up to him, clutching a folded piece of paper. Jack took it with a frown. Letters were rare in this place. Few could write, and fewer still had cause to send word. He broke the seal and saw the uneven handwriting at once. His stomach twisted. The letter was from Tom. The words were spare, direct, as if written with effort. Tom wrote that he had not been feeling well, that the years had finally begun to press on him harder than before, and that he feared he would not have much time left. He wrote of the storms that had passed since Jack left, of the quiet days, of the ships that had gone by. And then came the part that made Jack stop breathing for a moment. Tom had spoken to the officials on the mainland, those who oversaw the lighthouse and its keepers, and he had given Jack's name as the man who should take over when he could no longer climb the tower steps. "You understand this place," the letter read. "You respect it. That's what matters. If you choose to come back, you will find it waiting for you." Jack folded the paper carefully and sat staring at the ground until the boy had gone. His first thought was that he could not leave. Not now. Not with work to be done, debts still on his back. But the longer he sat there, the more hollow that argument felt. The village would go on whether he was there or not. There would always be someone else to cast the nets, someone else to argue at the market. But the lighthouse, that was different. It had been his refuge once, and now it called to him again. The decision did not come in a single moment. For several nights he lay awake, staring at the ceiling, hearing the echo of the sea in his head. He remembered the quiet meals with Tom, the feel of the worn wood under his hands as he cleaned the lamp, the way the light stretched across the water like a promise. Each memory was sharper than the last, until at last he could no longer deny it. He belonged there more than he ever had here. At dawn, he rose and began to prepare. His mother watched him silently as he gathered what little he owned: spare clothes, a coil of rope, a knife, a handful of coins. She said nothing, but he could feel her eyes on him, full of the understanding that mothers have when they know their sons are about to leave again. When he finally shouldered his pack and turned to go, she only nodded once. The boat he had repaired after the storm rocked gently at the end of the pier. He climbed in, pushed off, and began to row, the oars cutting cleanly through the water. The village grew smaller behind him, its roofs clustered like barnacles on the shore, until they were just a smudge against the land. Ahead, the open sea stretched wide and endless, and somewhere beyond the horizon lay the island with its solitary tower. For hours he rowed, letting the tide help him along, his muscles burning, but his mind strangely clear. Each stroke of the oars brought him closer to the place that had felt more like home than the house he had grown up in. He thought of Tom, of the lines on the old man's face, of his quiet strength. A tightness gripped Jack's chest as he imagined the keeper growing weaker with each day that passed. He rowed harder, as if speed could turn back time. As evening began to fall, the first outline of the island appeared, a dark tooth rising out of the sea. The sky behind it glowed faintly with the last light of the sun. Jack's heart pounded. He could almost see the white tower, could almost imagine the beam of the lighthouse sweeping out to meet him, though it was still too early for it to be lit. The closer he came, the more certain he felt. He was not simply returning for a visit this time. He was coming back to stay. The island was shrouded in a hushed stillness as Jack drew closer, the oars cutting through the darkening water with a rhythm that matched the thud of his heartbeat. The first thing he saw was the lighthouse itself, a pale silhouette against the evening sky, its windows reflecting the last light of the sun. The sight struck him with a force he had not expected. Months had passed since he had last been here, yet it felt as though the place had been waiting for him all this time. When the keel of the boat scraped the stones at the edge of the island, Jack jumped out, pulling it ashore with a strength born of urgency. His boots crunched on the gravel as he climbed the path he remembered so well, every step bringing him nearer to the house at the foot of the tower. The door was unlocked. Inside, the air was still and faintly cool, carrying the familiar sense of oil and salt and old wood. Jack called out, though he knew before he heard the silence that no one would answer. The table was tidy, the tools in their proper places, but there was a difference now, an absence that was palpable. On the table lay a folded piece of paper weighted down by a key. Jack picked it up and recognized Tom's handwriting at once, shaky but unmistakable. The note was short, written with the economy of words of a man who knew he was running out of time. If you are reading this, I am gone. The lighthouse is yours now, as it was mine. Keep the light burning. For a long time, Jack stood in the little room, the paper in his hands, the quiet pressing in around him. He had known this might be what he found, but the finality of it still struck him hard. Tom had been more than the man who saved his life. He had been a guide, a teacher, a reminder that there was a way to live that was not only survival, but purpose. Jack set the note back on the table, took the key, and stepped outside. He found the grave on the far side of the island, near a cluster of weather-worn rocks where the grass grew in sparse, wind-twisted patches. A wooden cross marked the spot, simple and unadorned, as fitting for a man who had lived a life without fanfare. Jack knelt in the grass, the wind tugging at his hair, and stayed there until the stars began to appear, one by one, over the dark water. When he finally rose, he felt something inside him settle. The days that followed were quiet, but no longer empty. Jack set about learning the rhythm of the island once more, this time as its sole keeper. There was much to do. The lantern room needed polishing. The logbook had to be brought up to date. The shoreline inspected for debris. He threw himself into the work, finding in it both solace and direction. Each morning he checked the mechanism of the great lamp, ensuring it was ready for the night ahead, and each evening he climbed the spiral stair to light it, standing there until the beam was turning steadily, sweeping its circle over the waves. At first, the solitude felt heavier than he remembered. There were moments when he would turn to speak and realize no one was there to hear him, moments when the house felt too still. Yet slowly, as the days lengthened into weeks, he found that the silence became his companion. The cries of the gulls, the crash of the surf, the creak of the timbers in the wind, these became the sounds of home. He began to repair things that had long been in need of it. A loose shutter, a cracked step, the old net shed near the shore. He mended the fishing nets and took to casting them on calm mornings, not out of desperation, but out of habit and quiet enjoyment. The island provided enough for him to live simply, and he found he no longer thought about what he had left behind in the village. The debts and arguments that had once seemed so large now felt like distant concerns, as if they belonged to another life. On the nights when storms blew in, Jack would stay awake, listening to the wind howl around the tower and watching the beam of the lighthouse cut through the darkness. It gave him a fierce sense of pride to know that somewhere out there, sailors could see that light and steer away from danger. He imagined them glancing toward the beam with the same relief he had felt the night it had guided him here. Months passed, and the seasons shifted. The grasses on the island turned from green to gold, and the air grew sharper. Jack wrote in the logbook with careful handwriting, noting each passing ship, each change in the weather, continuing the record that Tom had kept for decades. Sometimes, when he wrote, he felt as though the old man was still there, standing just behind him, nodding in quiet approval. One evening, as the sun sank low and set the sky ablaze with streaks of red and orange, Jack climbed the tower and stood for a long time by the lens, watching the sea. He thought about the man he had been when he first came here, a fisherman fighting the waves for every scrap of a living, driven by fear and debt. That man was gone now. In his place was someone who understood that there was more to life than the next day's catch, someone who had chosen to guard the light, not just for himself, but for others. When darkness finally came, he lit the lamp, watching as its glow spread outward, steady and sure. The beam turned, touched the horizon, and came back again, an endless circle of light. Jack stayed there a while, his hand resting on the brass rail, feeling the warmth of the lamp on his face. The sea was black and endless, but it did not frighten him. It felt instead like an old companion, vast and unknowable, but no longer hostile. Down below, the house was waiting, the little room warm from the stove, the table set with the few simple things he owned. Jack descended the stairs slowly, the sound of his boots on the stone steps echoing in the tower, and when he stepped outside, the wind off the water filled his lungs with the sharp, clean air of the sea. He looked once toward the grave in the distance, its cross just visible in the starlight, and nodded. The lighthouse shone behind him, its beam sweeping faithfully across the waves, and Jack knew he would keep it so for as long as he lived. Whatever storms might come, the light would not go out, and neither would the quiet resolve he carried within him. For the first time in his life, he was not merely surviving. He was exactly where he was meant to be. If this story moved you, don't stop here. Hit subscribe so you never miss the next one, and turn on the notification bell to stay updated. Take a moment to watch the next video waiting for you right now. There are more stories you won't want to miss. And don't forget to share this video with friends and family. Some stories are too meaningful to keep to yourself.